We're talking before we started recording with Jason Timpf. I brand him as the hardest working man in NBA journalism. How you doing, Jason? We were having a little behind the scenes talk about enemies and about these characters out there where it's adversarial constantly. I can't relate to it, Jason. It's very strange to me. I'm almost jealous of it. I couldn't handle it psychologically. I wish in a way I had enough fortitude to be adversarial and constantly at war with people online.
Yeah, first of all, it's good to see you, Ethan. I was looking forward to coming on. The NBA has gotten like the mother of all shots in the arm over the course of the last couple of months, which I want to talk a little bit about too. But yeah, I was talking with my former producer about it yesterday. Like, if I have even the slightest bit of a confrontational engagement with someone online, I get this like visceral, like uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah.
I hate it so much, and I like try so hard to avoid it. And like I see these media personalities, especially outside of sports, like in the world of politics, where you just every day they get up and it's war. And I'm just like, I just can't imagine doing that, because I get like painfully awkward if I get into a back and forth confrontational thing ever. And it's just an amazing dynamic.
I mean, it happens more in politics, and I've got a bit of a foot in that world without being completely in it. And it's one of the reasons why I wouldn't want to have 2 feet in that world. Right now, a friend of mine is just crushing another friend of mine. And I remember being in one of their houses at a dinner with both of them. And the points are ultimately correct. The criticism is correct. I'm not going to reveal what it is, but that doesn't happen in sports because the stakes just aren't that high. And we can go, hey, you've got that opinion. At some level, Jason, I'm morally offended that you believe LeBron is the GOAT over Michael Jordan, but we can we can step away from that without being angry at each other. But when the stakes are higher and it's about how society should be run, you watch people just torch their friendships. And maybe I'm too much of a softie. I don't like that. I don't want to be part of that.
That's the best thing about the world of sports, though, is like the unserious nature to it is just such a great lane to be in as far as media goes, because like even there's this thing that happens in the world of politics, and it's really happened over the course of the last decade, where it's become, if you're on that side, you're a bad person now.
Yeah.
And it didn't feel like it used to be that way when I was a kid. But like in the world of sports, if anybody ever comes at you that aggressively about a take, they immediately look like an imbecile, because it's like, dude, chill out. What are you doing? We're talking about the Nuggets. You know what I mean? Like that's the beautiful thing about that lane, is like it's to even be adversarial is an automatic, like you must just be an asshole. And so like that, it's kind of just a very different lane to exist in.
Yeah, and in a way, again, I wouldn't necessarily want to be that person, but I'm jealous of that level of disagreeability, the idea of not caring too much. Right now I'm watching The White Lotus, and there's a character, no idea if you're watching, probably not, because you watch about 10 hours of NBA a day. But there's a character who's, okay, yeah, great show. But in this season, there's a character whose life is falling apart because of a financial crime he's committed. He's avoiding it, and his life is unraveling in this public way. And while I haven't committed a financial crime, at least to my knowledge, I can completely relate to that sense of out there on the internet, your reputation is in variance. And I'm just feeling it as I'm watching this character unravel. And I wonder if there are some people where they just shrug it off and it just barely matters to them and they just keep doing what they do. I wish I had that in me.
I feel like in the world of politics in particular, you have to do that, because there's a certain amount of the news cycle and the repetitiveness and like the deeply entrenched nature of both sides too. It's turned into this thing where like I think everybody is getting just absolutely thrashed no matter what every single day, and you have to have a certain like constitution mentally to be able to withstand it.
Well, you've got to have a certain constitution mentally, Jason. I don't know if everybody here knows what you do, though certainly a lot of them do. You do this thing, it's like Jim Rome, where you're your own just person, solo, generating your own energy. And I think when people consume content, they're just receiving it and they go, oh, I like this. I'm doing it from the perspective as a media person. Sounds silly to say it, But I'm going, how is this guy doing this? How is he performing in this way where it seems so conversational, it seems so instructional, it seems so natural, but there's no other person to bounce the energy off of? This is a strange question to set you up with before we get into Warriors and Lakers and everything else, but do you imagine you're talking to somebody? What do you do when you're doing that for 40 minutes?
So I think Logan was the first person to really talk to me about this, and it kind of gave me some perspective on it. But I almost, when I'm doing more conversational shows, whether it be with Colin or it be with a guest who comes on my show, some of the other good NBA media guys that I've had the pleasure to work with in the past, those are more conversational. But when I do my solo shows, I almost kind of view them as like a lecture. And I know that sounds so boring and awful to say, but like, essentially the way I look at it is I do obsessive research in film and digging into the numbers, and I'm just presenting my findings. That's kind of the way I look at it. And so I do like really extensive notes. And so essentially like whenever I kind of lose steam, I just kind of reference back to my notes. It's weird. I don't read them necessarily because I almost write them down as a way of just like kind of like building out the thought. And then I kind of just go off the cuff. But then if I ever lose my train of thought, I just kind of reference back to the notes. But essentially, I think of the flow of the show as like I'm teaching. I'm trying to just teach like, hey, you're a big NBA fan, but you don't have the time to watch 30, 40 games in a week, but you still are curious and want to learn about the teams. Like, hey, like I took the time to watch all these teams. Let me tell you about what I'm learning. And you can have an opportunity to learn about these teams too at your own pace. And so we've done some things with the structure of the show too, where we've taken playlists on YouTube for every single team. So if like you're a Cavs fan and you just want to see Cavs stuff, you can go to our channel and just click on the Cavs playlist. And it's like every time we've talked about the Cavs, like listed and so on and so forth. And we just kind of present it like that, and it works. But at the same time, I like the mix up. I like to do the conversational stuff too. It's just very different, and you have to be more concise. And I can't, like, that's the beauty of my show. If I want to take 10 minutes breaking down like footwork on movement jump shots, like I did in my show today, like I have the ability to do that I can't do otherwise, you know?
I enjoyed that, by the way, as an aside, because I've had that thought of, why don't I like to shoot when I'm going to my right as a right-handed shooter? I know I don't, but I haven't really thought about the biomechanics. And that was, I think that was something that's clearly a labor of love for you to explain that. Not everybody is going into that topic, but I certainly enjoyed it as, okay, well, that's the reason. And here are the examples of NBA players and why it sets it up for them. And it was in the context of Steph Curry and how that was a measure of how he's really hitting his mark right now as a superstar, to be able to get his shot moving right going. I thought that was an excellent lecture by you, as you're calling it. But yes, it is a lecture, and I think that's why it works. And when people say algorithm and people say what's popular on YouTube, it's often with this derision and it's often pejorative. And I think it can obscure that there's something that works to it, and that people like to seek out knowledge. And a lot of people are coming to you because they want the why. Why is this happening? That's what a lot of your videos are about. Why? I might not know why the Cavs are performing at this just fantastic rate in the regular season. What is Kenny Atkinson doing? I don't have a lot of time to watch Eastern Conference basketball. I'm busy. I want to know why. And I can go to you, and it's a very engaging, cool professor explanation of what's going on with good energy. That something like that is successful, I think, is a good thing. It says something good about the content space. And for all the people complaining about how Charles Barkley has somehow convinced everybody to hate the modern NBA, I go, whatever's going on with the NBA and its popularity, I don't think is downstream from that, in part because there are people like you where if you want more positive, in-depth, nuanced, studied, you want to know why, that's available. That's out there. So that's going in a whole other direction and a digression. I'm just saying that I think you're doing a really good job with that, with why is this happening? People want to know, they look for it. It works. It's good. It's informative, and it's also what people want.
Yeah, there's a beauty in YouTube too, in like the way that it kind of keeps you going down a rabbit hole. I don't know if you have much of a curiosity streak in you, Ethan, but like I'll get into these like random rabbit holes where it's like, okay, I'm watching. Like one time I saw a suggested video from a channel called the Flight Channel, and it just takes like every aviation disaster in the history of aviation and kind of gives like this breakdown, not just what happened and why it happened, but it also like at the tail end of every video would show how this specific incident led to changes in the industry that limited accidents that happened in the future. And it was just this profoundly interesting format. And then every time I opened up YouTube, it would just suggest to me another Flight Channel video. And it's one of those things where like it's been super fascinating for me to see how that platform has given us such an insane amount of exposure. And it gives me a motivation every day to provide a really in-depth bit of analysis on whatever we're covering, because like every day could be the day that I loop in somebody new into our following. And it's like, it's such an interesting kind of platform in terms of weaponization. Cause like we don't do well in the podcast world, like relative to the other major NBA shows. Like that's not a place where we have a ton of success. It's like YouTube has just been the vehicle for us. And I think it also like YouTube's good for like the day-to-day instantaneous factor. It's easy to do live stuff there. And it also has like this specific algorithm piece to it with the search engine to where like people are getting on after a Cavs game and going Cavs reaction. And you want to make sure you're one of the people that show up in that list when that time comes. And so it's been a useful tool, and it's kind of fit really nicely with our format.
That's a tough balance, though. It's not quite audience capture, but it's this optimization that can lead you astray sometimes, where you try to max out exactly what people want, and then in the end you somehow don't give them what you want because you lose some measure of authenticity. I think that you've really been striking that balance in a positive direction. YouTube it's just a funny thing to think about. I don't try to reveal too much about my own family life, but it was funny. I was in the backyard with my son, and he's just gotten started playing basketball. And I'm trying to figure out how I go about being a sports dad. And I've made a commitment to myself to let things go. I'm not trying to tell him what to do too much. I think he doesn't want that. And I just want to let him do what he does. And something he's enjoyed that horrifies my wife, God bless her, he likes if I just film him in the backyard with the hoop and he talks like a YouTube presenter, because he's seen YouTube. We don't let him watch a lot of it, but with his friends. And he was showing me how to get fouled while making your shot and just talking and babbling like a YouTube presenter. And he said after he was done, he literally said, like and subscribe, which just my wife is just horrified by it. But because I think there's this fear of, this is an antisocial thing, the YouTube world, and what rabbit hole, and you're looking at one thing and then it's something terrible. And I think those are all well-founded concerns, but I was looking at it as, this is more in line with his culture. This is more in line with the kids' culture. They don't look at it TV. I was once on television and I told my son about it and said, hey, Dad was on TV. You want to check it out? And he's like, he literally said, maybe later. Like, he doesn't like television. There's no division between television and YouTube is a bigger deal to kids. And not only is it a bigger deal, there's a whole way of doing it and how you interact with the audience that makes an impression on them that they mimic at a young age. I'm not giving you a good question necessarily. I'm just sort of riffing on it, on how funny it is to me that even at a young age, they're plugged into the world that you're plugged into.
I think it makes so much more sense to that generation. I don't know about you, Ethan, but every time these days that I watch television, like actual television, and I would argue 95% of the time I'm watching television these days, it's sports, like actual live sports. Yeah. But every time I find myself like watching Sports Center or watching literally any other form of television content that's not a live sports event, the cadence is jarring. Everyone feels like they're on the clock when they're speaking. There's this like kind of like stilted nature to the flow because of the commercial setup and all that kind of stuff. One of my favorite things about YouTube is there are days where I do 17-minute shows. There are days that I do an hour and 17-minute shows. There are days that we go 43 minutes. It's all like 100% catered to like, I talk until I don't have anything interesting to say, and then I stop. And the even like the way that the commercials are set up, it's very flexible. It's there's different ways to work around it. You can pay for the YouTube subscription where you don't have to watch ads. There's like a bunch of different kind of workarounds there. It just is such a streamlined format. It's been really interesting actually to see how like YouTube kind of had a renaissance as it's become this like newer tool, and it fits so much more easily into the lifestyle of Gen Z and just the way that they do everything.
I didn't really think about it having a renaissance. I guess I am old enough for YouTube to have had a dark ages and a renaissance. That does make sense. It is true. But yeah, my viewing habits have tilted in the YouTube direction, and it's because I can explore the curiosity in these strange new directions. And with NBA too, I think Ben Taylor does a lot of the historical explorations on YouTube of, well, how good was this player really in the 90s, in the playoffs? How good was Reggie Miller really? That's not anything I could explore in, I don't know, 2005, 2006, or how good was John Stockton? Maybe, I'm trying to remember if Taylor thinks Stockton was maybe a little bit overrated as a playoff performer. Don't want to get that wrong if that's the case.
I think he does, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. That's his take on it, and I'll trust him because I have not done the work on that. But you can explore your curiosity in that way as a fan in ways that you couldn't. You just had such little to go on. You had SportsCenter highlights, you had the box scores, you had the live games, and now there's just so much more out there. And I don't know if we want to talk about, maybe we'll save this at the end of the show, the overall NBA's constant popularity question. Channing Frye saying that the NBA has a nostalgia problem. Gilbert Arenas, who's been saying similar. We can discuss all of that, but I want to talk about the right now because, like you said, there's a shot in the arm right now. It's interesting right now, especially if you are a West Coast basketball fan. Why, Jason, I've got a little theory about it. Jimmy Butler trade happens. There's not one obvious way to feel about it. I know very astute observers of the NBA who were down on it. You were the opposite. You were very bullish about it. And I want to know why you thought that it would work. And it obviously has. They're 12-1 with Butler so far. It's just been a complete, if you want to talk about renaissance, there's been a renaissance of the Warriors now. Why do you think you got this one right?
So I think that there's a spectrum when it comes to NBA analysis these days, where it's kind of like on one side there's the art, and on the other side there's a science to it.
Yeah,
and I'm generally on the basketball is more art than science side of things. And I think in general, we try to synthesize teams down to combinations of talent, or like essentially the sum of parts, if you want to think of it in that way. And so what'll happen is we'll see a Warriors team and we'll be like, they're bad. These metrics tell us they're bad. These statistical realities tell us they're bad. Therefore, they are bad. Jimmy is bad based on his performance relative to previous years. So why would you trade Andrew Wiggins, who's been one of the dependable players for the Warriors this year in terms of like their primary point of attack guy, the only guy they can really count on to kind of like contribute offensively relatively consistently next to Steph? Like, why would you trade this player for that player? There's this poll that I saw from, I think it was from the Warriors World Twitter feed. I don't know if you saw it yesterday, but
I did see it.
Yeah, I thought that was super interesting how people said, like, would you rather have Andrew Wiggins or Jimmy Butler straight up right now? And most people were saying they want Andrew Wiggins. And so I think that's part of the science part of the analysis, where it's like, here are these factual realities that are screaming in our face. And if we acknowledge these things, then this deal would not actually solve anything. The reason why I think basketball is more art than science is because I think there's just a ton of intricacies in the way that talent fits with each other. And I saw this very simple problem with the Warriors this year. They had this profound depth of role player talent to the point where it wasn't just they had a lot of guys who could play. They had too many guys who could do these roles. They had, like, I think I counted 15 different players on their on their roster before the Jimmy trade that were like, hey, this guy can play minutes for us. And then over the course of the season, it got even more profound because it's like, oh wait, Guy Santos can play. Oh wait, Quentin Post can play. Like, we're finding all these players, Pat Spencer can play a little bit. We're finding all these dudes who can play. And so it really just became about roster balance. So you have this apex star in Steph Curry, and then you have this plethora of role player talent, but you didn't have the secondary star, which every other team in the NBA has. And so what ends up happening is the thing that happens in every single industry, which is when you take people and you ask them to do more than they're capable of, they become inconsistent and they start to make mistakes. And so there was a lot of issues within the role player talent. And then it compounded into now it's like, we don't think these role players are good. And it's like, actually, they are good at these specific things. Take Brandon Podziemski and Moses Moody, for instance. Brandon Podziemski is a good point of attack defender, a great rebounder, and he's a very good connective offensive player playing with an advantage and bringing all of the talent together. Moses Moody is a very good point of attack defender and a very good spot up shooter. He can knock down just wide open catch and shoot threes out of the corner really well. If you start to ask them to expand out of that, and it's like, okay, on any given night, we have this committee of secondary stars. It's like this night it's Brandon. This night it's Kuminga. This night it's Wiggins. This night it's Buddy Hield. This night it's Dennis Schroeder, or whatever it was. It became one of those things where all of those guys were failing because they were being asked to do too much. Bringing in Jimmy Butler accomplished two things. It brought in a player that could take all of those higher level star type of responsibilities and alleviate that responsibility from the role players, and it shortened the rotation. It got them down to like, now they have 11 guys they can trust instead of 15. And so all of a sudden these roles started to crystallize. Now it's like, we don't need to start anybody next to Steph but Brandon Podziemski. He's the guy who should start. Yeah. Moses Moody is now in the Andrew Wiggins role. That's like what he's doing. He's guarding the other team's best forward, and he's picking them up full court. He's applying ball pressure, and he's spotting up in the corner. It crystallized everyone's roles, and it balanced out the specific weakness was they had a bunch of limited role players doing a star's job. And now Jimmy Butler has stepped in and done that star's job. And so really it was just about roster balance. And then I think the last bit I'd say about it, and we saw this with LeBron too, as he got re-engaged after the Luka trade. These older vets that are in their late 30s, the grind of the regular season is hard. They better believe that what they're doing matters in the big picture, or they're going to lose steam. And I think both LeBron and Steph lost steam early in the season with their limited rosters.
I'm calling this chasing the rabbit. There's no rabbit to chase. And I think that's a good observation. It's a veteran thing. A young player doesn't need the rabbit. The rabbit is getting paid for the first time or just getting more status. Draymond needs a rabbit. There needs to be a rabbit to chase. And all of a sudden, when there's a rabbit, you go, oh, whoa, they're not washed up. Oh, no, they have more, but they need a reason to do it. Now, maybe I can coin this, and you can tell me if this already exists as a term, and I've just been so out of the loop that I'm repeating something somebody has said. The Jimmy Butler acquisition and also the Luka trade has made me think about fit is a funny thing in the NBA because rest is so emphasized. And I think there's fit with and fit without. And what Jimmy Butler has accomplished for the Warriors and why it's just been such a home run short term before he does his whole thing he does at the end, and it always ends bad like a Taylor Swift song. But for now, what's been accomplished, the fit with Steph is great. You need pressure on the rim, and Steph then can operate around that. But the fit without is great as well, because Jimmy Butler can be the hub of an offense when Steph sits. It's so hard to get good fit with and good fit without. I think Luka and LeBron are just an amazing fit without. When one guy sits down, the other guy can just run the offense. The fit with has been impressive. I don't know if it's an optimal fit with. We will see that hopefully in the postseason, but the fit without is great. And so that's something that I want to popularize. And maybe you can tell me it's already been popularized, but the fit with and the fit without is something I've been thinking about in the aftermath of these trades.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I through a different terminology, I've looked at it as like, it's kind of like trading for a little bit of KD and a little bit of Andre Iguodala. Because like one of the things with Jimmy Butler is he's a little Tatum-esque in the sense that he's not really awesome at anything, but he's really good at everything. You know what I mean? Like he's a good point of attack defender, a good off-ball defender, a good rebounder, a good post player, a good, screen and roll threat off and on the ball. Like he's just pretty good at everything. And so he's been able to fill all of these different roles. It's like, okay, we're facing a zone defense. Well, Jimmy's the perfect guy to put in the middle of the floor. Okay, we're going against a team where there are smalls that we can look to capitalize in space. Okay, well, Jimmy's got Jalen Brunson on the left wing and he can just take him to work. Okay, we used to run a ton of inverted ball screens with Andrew Wiggins with Steph screening for him. Now we can do that with Jimmy. He's much, much higher level playmaker. I read a stat on the show a while back, but like Jimmy's had like several orders of magnitude higher assist output in his career. He's just a much better playmaker than Andrew Wiggins ever was. There's just all these like little areas you can plug him into. And by the way, that's the case for how LeBron has been so successful this season with the Lakers, is he's been their Swiss Army knife, and they've plugged him into all these different spots depending on what the team needs. I'm a little more bullish on the Luka LeBron feed because there's this new role that's really crystallized over the last 5 to 10 years in the NBA. I'm calling it the weak side scoring forward. And it's basically like most teams right now are tagging the roller or are filling the paint with that weak side defender out of the weak side corner. And so the skip pass is becoming the pass that's open most often for the primary ball handler. And these guys are basically professional closeout attackers. So they take catch and shoot jump shots, or they drive as the defender is chasing them off the line. Rui Hachimura used to be in this role for the Lakers, but now LeBron's getting a lot of those touches off of Luka. And the Denver game in particular was a great example where you got to see LeBron attacking a lot off of that skip pass. Like where it's actually been more clunky has been when Luka's off the ball, because he just hasn't been shooting the ball very well. He's a very poor spot-up shooter in general. But I think JJ is really going to lean over the course of the rest of the season into just basically force-feeding Luka when he's on the floor and leaning more into LeBron and Austin when they're off the floor. But yeah, like that really is the ultimate fit there, is when you can count on both guys to be successful in both roles. And that's the thing. Jimmy has provided a certain floor when Steph is off the floor that was not there in the past. That was part of the reason why teams got so pessimistic, or everyone got so pessimistic on the Warriors. They looked awful at stretches this year, like straight up awful. But it's because you had these super limited lineups out there. I watched a game against the Lakers where Pat Spencer and Brandon Pajemski were the two shot creators for a lineup against the Lakers bench group. And like, that's the thing. There's, you know how Bill Simmons in his basketball, did you ever read the Bill Simmons basketball book?
I did.
Yeah. He used to talk about the secret, right? And it's like, that's really the thing. Like sometimes one small tweak can cause a bunch of parts to fall into place, and suddenly a team can greatly outperform what they used to look like. Cleveland's a great example of it too. It's like Darius Garland got healthy and better, and Evan Mobley got a little bit better in a couple of key areas. And then Kenny Atkinson came in and emphasized 2 or 3 different schematic things that were different than what they did in the past. They embraced them, and they went from a mediocre Eastern Conference playoff team to a 69 win pace. Like, and you couldn't quantify that by saying, you know, this roster addition or this specific tweak. No, it's like a couple of small things that kind of fell into place in very specific areas, and a team explodes. And that's part of that art of basketball that's very difficult to like quantify with catch-all metrics and different scientific approaches to it.
I completely agree. It's that, and it's true in media, it's true in business. The margin between success and failure is just razor thin. It's razor thin. The difference between terrible, dysfunctional, and oh my God, invincible is just so much smaller in so many walks of life than you could ever know. And so you can come to me and you say, like, here are the win shares for Jimmy Butler since the Warriors got him. He has added this many wins, and it will probably be fewer wins than you would think, and it would probably be incorrect. It would be incorrect. It can't possibly quantify these moments where the Warriors would just get their back broken because there's a run when Steph sits down, or even when he's in there and he just doesn't have it. And they let go of the rope, as Mark Jackson would say. I don't know how many times that would have happened over these past 13, 14 games, whatever. but I can almost guarantee you that it would have happened more times than whatever the win share would be for Jimmy Butler. It's just incalculable. And similarly with football, they often tell you that this guy is worth this many points, or nobody is worth all that much other than the quarterback. Maybe, but I think it's very contextual. I think it's very situational. There are Jenga pieces where if you take out that Jenga piece, the whole building falls down. And maybe one day we'll be able to quantify that properly, but we are just not there yet.
Oh, yeah. Like a perfect example for me is Jackson Hayes with the Lakers. Before the Anthony Davis trade, he was an extremely limited backup center. And the Lakers were so bad at creating space for their vertical spacers in that construct that Jackson was a guy who would occasionally get a big dunk on a roll, but he was super limited defensively and it didn't really make a ton of sense. He is vitally important in this construct of the Lakers because when Anthony Davis was on the team, every defensive game plan was built around overplaying the role because AD is one of the best role men in the NBA and he was their best player. Now everything is geared towards the ball handler, and there's always Dorian Finney-Smith, LeBron, or Rui, or somebody who can really play on the skip. So now the defenses really have to make a decision based on whether or not to take away that lob threat or to let that guy go and take away the skip pass. And so as a result, when Jackson's out, it's like all of a sudden guys like Trey Jemison and Jared Vanderbilt who can't jump and they can't finish around the rim with any sort of vertical spacing threat. Like it's like, oh my goodness, we need Jackson. It's crazy how that can make such a big difference because of just a tweak in the roster. Like every player's value is specifically unique in that system. Another really quick example is Jamal Murray. I don't think Jamal Murray looks nearly as valuable in any other system because he's really only great at one thing, and it's shot making. But like next to Jokic, his shot making is the ultimate ceiling raiser. And so Jamal Murray's value in the Denver Nuggets system is every bit as important as some of the best guards in the league, even though that's not what we would consider Jamal to be. And it's all part of that artistic side of the game.
It's that with Jamal, and it's also he's just been playing with Jokic for so many years that they've got a telepathy. So you could theoretically replace Murray with somebody who's better than Murray and get worse results just because you don't have that component that's been built up for a decade or whatever it's been. And it's just very contextual in that way. And that's something I like about what you do. You've got a very blood and bones perspective on basketball. And when you talk about the postseason, the physical nature of it, how that's so much different. And it's this human aspect of the game that I don't know if we got away from it. I'm not sure. Maybe you've got a perspective on whether we got away from it, because the math matters. Understanding that 3 is more than 2 matters. Understanding that you shouldn't just go with counting stats and there's pace of play. You know, all of these things matter. And there were guys who were overrated because whatever, their games were more aesthetically pleasing and we didn't maybe properly appreciate Chauncey Billups in his prime. But I don't know. Do you think we got away from the blood and bones aspect of basketball and we're bringing it back? Or do you think that these things have been in synthesis for a while?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there is real value in focusing on certain regular season trends through the advanced metric lens. I think like the way here's a simple stat to kind of frame this conversation. So what happens every year? We have a new team that starts kicking everybody's butt, right? Like think about like the Memphis Grizzlies a couple years ago when they first kind of came onto the scene. This year it's Cleveland in particular is the big kind of shocking one. And it happens every single year. There's another team that'll like tomorrow, next year it'll probably be Houston, and Houston will be like a 1 or 2 seed all year long. And everyone's going to be like, oh my God, the Houston Rockets, we need to take them seriously as a championship contender. But here's the thing. 5 of the last 7 teams to either win 60 games in a regular season or to win at a 60-game pace in these shortened seasons because of COVID, failed to win their conference in the playoffs. And 4 of those 5 teams failed to win in the second round. So there is a clear shift that takes place when you get into the postseason where the game changes. it's a combination of a bunch of factors. Some of it is officiating and it getting more physical. Some of it is game planning. I think a good portion of it is like veterans who chill in the regular season and then leverage their athletic gifts at a much higher level when they get into high leverage situations. It's a combination of all these different factors. And then the big one for me is like, it really just comes down to, for 2 weeks, how do you and your guys match up against this team and their guys? Really, nothing else matters at that point. Nothing you did in the regular season, your defensive rating or any of that stuff even has a tiny bit of a bearing on whether or not so-and-so can guard so-and-so or vice versa. Because that's matchups in a nutshell. It's like Minnesota. It's like they had the big bodies to really make Jokic work and to wear him down, and he looked exhausted by the tail end of that series. And like that literally was all that mattered at the end of the day as they fell apart. And so where I think the balance is I do think that that more analytical approach to the game, the less blood and bones approach, is important in the regular season as a filter, because there is a mandatory minimum level of production in the regular season statistically and analytically that every champion reaches. So where I do think it matters is like when I see people say, oh, like the Milwaukee Bucks are just not good enough. Here are these basic statistical reasons why. The blood and bones approach would be like Giannis and Dame in a playoff series. How are you going to handle that? And it's like, well, they're just not good enough as a baseline at these 4 or 5 different things to ever have a chance to win 4 playoff rounds. And NBA history tells us that that's the case. The interesting thing is like the champion ends up usually coming from that like just second tier of wins, like mid to high 50s, veteran team, ends up being a team that's near the top of the standings, that's very sharp in all these major analytical categories, but that isn't as impressive as the young athletic team that's kicking everybody's butt. That team is usually who wins. Boston last year is an exception to that, but I would argue Boston was knocking on the door year after year. So like the dominant regular season was almost separate from the fact that this was a team that was in the finals 2 years earlier, that was in the conference finals, 3 of the previous 4 years. And so honestly, it's a combination of both. I use that approach as a filter for teams, but ultimately I try to almost reduce it down to matchups when you get into the postseason, because that's literally what happens every single year after we get through the 82.
Do you expect the Thunder to pull a similar trick of being so dominant in the regular season, maybe a little bit doubted because they're early in their journey? Do you expect them to produce that in the postseason? I just had somebody call one of their games, an announcer who just texted me and said, doubt them at your peril. I mean, they're incredible. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm just a casual fan nowadays. I rely on you, Jason. Do you believe in the Thunder?
They're a legitimate top-tier championship contender, but they, to me, are an example of a team that is probably not as good as their regular season record would lead you to believe. A simple way to synthesize it would be to say Shea is the only one of their core rotation players, their core 8, like the 8 guys they'll go down with in a playoff series. Shea's the only one who's over the age of 26.
Yeah.
If you look at Boston as a counterexample, and their core 8 rotation players, Tatum's the only guy who is 26. Every single other one of the guys in that rotation is older. So, do you really expect Boston, a defending champ, to leverage themselves night to night in a way that the group of 22-year-olds is? Obviously not. That doesn't take a ton of critical thinking. And so the reality is somewhere in the middle. And here's the thing, they can win, and they might just catch some favorable matchups, and maybe J-Dub and Chet have great playoff runs, and maybe they win. But what NBA history tells us is the Thunder will probably break through in a different circumstance. What it'll probably look like is either next year or the year after, they'll be like a 2 or a 3 seed, and people will be a little bit cool on them, but J-Dub will be 25, Chet will be a little older. They'll have been in some wars in the playoffs already. They'll have knocked on the door a few times, and suddenly they'll break through. That's what NBA history tells us. So I don't want to write off the Thunder. I think it's more likely than not that someone else wins this year.
And even if they do go to the finals, I don't like first-time finals teams. If they're going against the Celtics, I would just pound the Celtics. I haven't looked up the history of this. I think it's a little confounded by the pandemic seasons, perhaps, but this is something you get more of an appreciation for on the media side having to fly to these games and these practices, but the finals is totally different than the rest of the postseason, and the scheduling is different, and how you do your practice is different. Media availability is different, and these teams, they're creatures of routines in many ways. It just all gets jumbled, and so if you've been through it like the Celtics have, I think that is it's an advantage that wouldn't seem obvious hourly, but it's a tremendous advantage. But now I'm getting a little bit derailed. I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, playing the Thunder forward into the finals. There's just more to go with. I like that perspective, though, on how many veterans you need. I think I call that the Kevin Arnovitz grown men win basketball games in series, or grown-ass men do rule. I think I had a question about this.
I have a quick follow up on that.
Tell me.
We've had just a crazy sequence over the course of March. I was thinking about it yesterday, because yesterday was just the third time I've touched a basketball all month. And we had a death in the family. We had some travel. We had just had all this stuff going on. So it's just been like really busy. And I went to go play, and like I'm not in as good a shape because I haven't been playing, and I've been just a little distant from the game. But like, I'm at an age now where I've played so much that there's a certain amount of like just experience that I can lean on to be an effective basketball player. And I was thinking about it while I was at the gym yesterday. I was like, I remember when I was young and I was in my 20s, and we would stack up a team with a bunch of like talented young players, and we'd play in these men's leagues. And it was always like this old group of beer gut dudes who were like 38 to 45 who would like beat us every time. And like I have such another understanding for that now, because it's two things. It's size and strength. Like carrying that extra weight really helps. And I'm just about 25 pounds heavier than I was when I was in my early 20s. But the second piece of it is like, you can play slow, and you can understand the game, and the playoffs do slow down. And like that experience is just such a huge part of it. And like every single player I can think of has struggled in their first finals appearance. Tatum, brutal in his first finals. Like Steph, up until the end of that final series, was pretty brutal. LeBron's first finals, brutal. Even his second finals was brutal. Like, I don't know what it is, and you can pick it up immediately when you turn on the television, but it tangibly feels weird and different when you're watching a finals, even compared to the conference finals. It's such a bizarre shift.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is the cognizance that the country in many ways is watching, that there are maybe 20 million people watching, at least in the heyday, and this is the final round. I don't know how much of that creeps into it versus the bubble championship, where Anthony Davis was just shooting easy breezy from the outside. Maybe he would have done that in a more traditional finals. I don't know. And how much of it is the scheduling being totally screwed up? I'm not sure. There's something, though, about pertaining to the Thunder and Gilgeous-Alexander that you said. Well, first of all, you said that you don't like MVP debates, so you don't spend too much time on it. And I found that to be interesting. But you also said something that I thought was a good explanation, which is, I think Jokic is a better basketball player than SGA, but that's never been the way we've given MVP. So your take is that SGA is the MVP, and it's not even close, but that's not saying he's the best player. That's Jokic. Let's get into that. I like this topic.
It just kind of fits like the way that the award has traditionally been given out. It's always been like a combination of a bunch of factors. Now, the reason why I hate MVP, there's two main reasons. One, there is an inconsistency in the way the criteria is applied. That can get frustrating sometimes. The second piece of it, we were lamenting the overuse of advanced metrics. I've done enough picking of people's brains behind the scenes to know that a good chunk of the voter pool leans heavily on that stuff, which I just disagree with. But like, so that's part of it. Also, like, it's like, to me, it's like fantasy basketball. And you talked about the blood and bones element. I'm just really focused on real basketball, in the sense that, like, I think it's more interesting to talk about like how good these teams are, how they match up against each other in the playoffs over the course of March and April, than it is to talk about first team All NBA, second team All NBA. And that's kind of just a personal preference of mine. So like, I just think there are better people to talk to when it comes to that sort of thing. That said, my take on it is, like, over the course of the history of the league, it's been a combination of like how good your team is, how specifically valuable you are to that team, there's always been a narrative element. There's always been a momentum type of narrative element to it. And so really the foundational piece of Shea's case is that they're 11 games up on OKC or on Denver. So if you're 11 games up, your case has to be profoundly strong over that other player in order to close that gap. And like, I think there are a couple things, like Shea's offensive workload has been underrated this year, with Chet being out for as often as he's been out. J-Dub had a poor start to the season as a jump shooter, which was a big hit for them. Hartenstein was out a good chunk of the year. The Thunder, when they're healthy, are a super talented roster, and they're exceptionally good on defense. But Shea has carried an enormous offensive load for that team. And I think it's not Jason Tatum alongside four $30 million players. It's a lot of young dudes in their early 20s that are pretty inconsistent. And a lot of these games end up kind of degrading down into Shea's got to create everything. And he's done a really good job of it. And then the second piece of it that I think was overlooked, and I look at this like LeBron. Like LeBron got a lot of criticism for the defensive end over the course of the last, half decade, for good reason, and it has hurt his team at times as he's been lazy. But we always knew LeBron could leverage himself more defensively when things mattered. I mean, he's been one of the best defensive players in the league over the last 2 months. Jokic is not that level of defender when he's healthy, but when Jokic is engaged and going on defense, he's average. He's an elite defensive rebounder, and there's one specific coverage that he can do a pretty good job of. Like, Jokic has that level. But for 2 years now, he's been pulling the LeBron on defense and just saving his legs. And Denver's 20th in defense this year. It's been a consistent problem. It's been a consistent part of why they've lost games. And so I think Jokic's case just has a few too many cracks in it. And Shea's case is so strong that it's just too much to cover that 11-game gap. Like, I think it's just too much to overcome. And so, and then this is the last piece of it that I'll say. They had this head-to-head these last 2 games, right? And Shea dominates the first game. He drops 40. The Thunder win by 24. The Nuggets get it back last night, and Jokic goes for 35, 18, and 8. So conventional wisdom would be like, well, Jokic kind of made up for what happened the previous night. But if you watch the game, like, the Thunder scored 73 points in the first half. J-Dub leaves the game with a hip strain. And Michael Malone comes out in the second half and double teams Shea the second he crosses half court the rest of the game. Because he knows J-Dub's not out there. They don't have enough offensive talent. This is going to work. And so in a weird way, even though Denver kind of flipped the script last night, it ended up being another feather in the cap of Shea's MVP case, because the way they finally slowed down the Thunder was they just straight up didn't allow Shea to cross half court with the ball. And so, like, I think he's got a pretty commanding lead at this point.
I would agree on all counts. And I would agree Jokic being the better player and Shea given more value. And I also wish the MVP discussion would return to what it used to be, which is, if you are part of the team that has submitted maybe a top 1 or 2 performance for that regular season, we go with best player on that team. Some people find that to be ridiculous. I just don't like the baseballification of the award that's happened. I thought it was maybe an original sin when Russell Westbrook won it with the being 6th in the West or whatever it was that season. That's just not what that award was. It was an award for it was a team award and a player award, even if it was never explained, because, as you said, the criteria has never actually been explained, just so we can argue about everything. But this was an analytics movement to separate a player out from their performance, because people understood that baseballification, a pitcher, for instance, doesn't really control whether or not the team wins the baseball game. He just controls what he does out there. So giving Cy Young based on how many games won is absurd. That mentality was taken to the NBA with MVP, and I just don't think that's what it is. And also, I don't care as much. If you've raised your team from a level of being a 30-win team to a 45-win team, well, that's impressive. That's really cool, I guess. But realistically, in terms of the history of how we're going to remember that season, that actually doesn't do a whole lot. I'm more interested in somebody who played a starring role on a starring team than somebody who maybe created more wins in what feels like a vacuum. I can't get everybody to just agree with me on that, but I don't think that's been great. I prefer the days where we went best player on one of the two best teams and we knew what we were talking about.
Playing on one of the best teams in the league is a fundamentally different experience than playing on a middle tier team too. Like, I thought it was super interesting when JJ talked about this in an interview. It was in the last couple of weeks, but he talked about how one of the most surprising things for him about becoming an NBA coach was how important it is just to get your guys to play hard. And it makes a lot of sense when you really think about it, because playing winning championship basketball sucks. It's like a lot of running, a lot of mental fatigue as you're like relentlessly executing a game plan night to night. There's a certain level of physical competing in terms of for defensive positioning and defensive rebounding and offensive rebounding and all these different things. It sucks. And so actually doing it every night is a challenge, especially when you're trying to coach a bunch of millionaires. I thought that quote from JJ Redick was really fascinating. I've referred to this concept over the years as motivational advantage. And the motivational advantage even extends into the playoffs. I think there are a lot of betting opportunities when like a team is up 2-0 and they go on the road. That game 3 at home is always such a buzzsaw to try to win on the road. Like that, the motivational advantage is a huge part of series basketball and regular season basketball. And so like playing for a low pressure 47 win Oklahoma City Thunder team, you're just getting a lot more mediocre efforts every night out of opponents. Whereas it's like, okay, you know, James Harden and the Rockets are coming to town. They're the number 2 seed in the West or the 1 seed in the West or whatever. Like it's a totally different challenge. Every time Shea shows up in an arena now, like that team is looking for an opportunity for a signature win, the team they're playing against. And so I think in general, like extending to your point that being one of the top teams is just a fundamentally different experience. And so that's a big part of why that player is dealing with a tougher challenge every single night.
I would agree with that. Let's go with some of the state of the NBA stuff, the less breakdown of basketball. Channing Frye said something, I think it was maybe February 22nd, oddly specific with that date I am, but whatever, about how the NBA has a nostalgia problem. I'll give my riff on it, let you riff on it. I understand what people are saying when they say that, because there have been frustrations with the NBA currently. And people will say, I used to like the NBA better. And that's a narrative that's out there that is felt by a lot of people. And the game is more skilled right now than it used to be. Players can just do things. It's almost frustrating how good players are. How many guys over 6'8" will just do a sidestep 3-pointer after a fake. If you saw that happen in 1993, your mind would be blown. But I think ultimately nostalgia is a good thing. It's great to have a bunch of people who used to love basketball. If you didn't have that, you just have fewer people who wanted anything to do with the current product. So I don't like that trashing of the past or trashing of the people for having an attachment to it. Where do you come down on all of this?
So I think we're all a little jaded by just the sheer amount of content that's available. It's like a little thing. Like when I was in my 20s, I was broke. And so when we'd go travel, I would take the cheapest accommodations I could find and I would crash on uncomfortable beds and do whatever it was I needed to do. And now it's like my wife and I, it's like we work really hard. It's like we're going skiing. It's like I want a king size bed because I sleep like shit when I don't sleep on my king size bed. Like this is what I expect, you know? And it's like, I think there are some realities to the quality of older basketball that were hidden by the fact that there just weren't a ton of options for people to watch. And so there was less complaining. And, you know, I think that's the hardest part for me to engage with is when I hear people try to explain why they think the old game was better. There's nothing of substance being offered. I'll give you an example. I was skiing with my wife this last week in Breckenridge. I was on a lift. And my wife and I were sitting on one side of the lift. These two dudes next to me were talking about the NBA. And I just eavesdropped the whole thing, didn't engage at all. And this one guy was clearly an NBA fan. He's like, you watch the NBA? I'm a big fan of the NBA. Like, I don't even like watching college. They're just not good enough. I really enjoy the NBA. And the guy next to him just unleashed the most stereotypical boomer, the NBA sucks take
no defense
you've ever heard. And like, it was like, he dropped this one too. He's like, I don't think any player should make over $2 million. They make too much money. No ticket should be worth more than $40. And like, then he was like, but NFL players should get rich because they put their bodies on the line. It was like the most nonsensical, like just out there rant. And then I sat there and I was like, okay, like you've just decided you don't like the NBA. And it's probably because you don't have time to watch it. And you like, there's just other more important stuff going on in your life. And I have no problem with that. But it's like, you're really just pontificating at this point and dropping a bunch of nonsense as you try to explain it. And it's like, when I think back to watching basketball 20 years ago, I think about big, bulky forwards taking ugly 17-footers. I think about
Charles Oakley.
Yeah, and Drew Gooden and David West.
I went farther back. I zoomed a decade beyond you because I'm a little bit older. But yes, Drew Gooden as well at a later date.
All of that. And like, and here's the thing, like there are certain elements that were better. The physical competitiveness, there was a certain aura around star players and ISO basketball around that time. But the reality is I think basketball has incrementally gotten better through sophistication on both ends of the floor and increases in talent. It just hasn't gotten better enough relative to the change in content. To put it very simply, the 1998 NBA Finals were not competing against the same level of content that the 2025 NBA Finals will compete against. And so really, it's the lack of urgency to me that has killed some of the NBA interest. Why would you care about this game that doesn't matter? Like the Lakers just dropped a game to the Nets last night. It does not matter. It literally doesn't matter. The Warriors had a stretch in the middle of the season where they were abysmally bad. And they're considered by many folks now to be a top tier championship contender with the trade of Jimmy Butler. So like there's so little urgency. There's so little importance on each NBA regular season game that they're working uphill no matter what. And so I think that's really the problem. That's the boring answer to the problem. And like there are little things you can nitpick about foul grifting and some of the stuff about the way the game is discussed. And there are little things like that. But I don't think any of that even comes close to the simple fact that a kid's going to probably scroll through TikTok or watch one of his favorite TV shows on a streaming service before he's going to watch Nets Lakers on a random Monday night.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And well, I have a take. My main complaint, and it's crazy to me that other people don't go with it as much, that I think is a real thing. But I'll table that for a second to say I totally agree with people will make an emotional decision and then they'll rationalize it. But ultimately, you've got to contend with so many people making that emotional decision. If a bunch of people are deciding, I don't like the NBA, and the reasons they give are nonsense, you still have to contend with there's a reason that they're not emotionally connecting to it, and you've got to figure it out. Now, the reason that has been galling me lately, because now the Warriors have a rabbit to chase, I'm watching more Warriors. The replay review, especially at the end of games, and how they've added another one, especially if you have a kid in this content economy that you reference, where there's so much competing. Oh, is it brutal? It's so brutal because you want the kid to watch the fourth quarter when the action is at its most suspenseful and there's going to be a win or a loss. And then all of a sudden, when the game just screeches to a halt, they're out. At least my son's, I cannot get him to pay attention when that happens. And that's a decision by the NBA that they probably did because they want to make sure everything's on the up and up for the gambling and the calls are correct. But it is not worth it. And I think more people need to just make that point. If the game right now is up against all this other stuff, man, can you not afford to just stop all the action? You really can't. People, younger people especially, tap out. One other thing, as a random aside too, thinking back to that 98 finals, strange fact, Jason, are you aware that not only the most watched game ever, the most watched college game ever, and the most watched NBA All-Star game ever all happened in Salt Lake City? Maybe that's the solution to the NBA's problems. More games, Salt Lake City, Utah. But anyway, you can take all of that wherever you want to take it.
It's the point you're making is important, which is like the reason doesn't really matter as much as the reality that less people are watching. And I think that's worth mentioning and exploring. I think that there are some realities with the NBA relative to a league like the NFL that you have to acknowledge. So, for instance, you were talking about like how in YouTube there's all these different lanes. I don't view myself as competing with Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo. Their format is entirely different. It's an entirely different experience. Like if I want to listen to a basketball breakdown of the Lakers, I'm going to listen to someone like Pete Zayas from Laker Film Room. But if I want to hear like casual discussion that's entertaining, light, and has a lot of chemistry, I'm going to go to Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo, right? Or even like we were talking earlier with Thinking Basketball with Ben Taylor. Like he's an entirely different lane than me. I'm not competing with him at all. And that's the thing. Like to me, the NFL is an urgency sport. They are built on urgency and intensity. The NBA to me is an inventory sport.
Yeah.
So it's less to me about hitting big numbers per se in individual games. And it's more about, can the league find ways to make money with the total packaging of their product down the line? And so I think while there are realities around the urgency and realities around the ratings, and I do think changes should be made. You mentioned the replay review. I also think the foul grifting is a huge example of a problem that they've got to get out of the league. The end of games in general is really rough. Like end of games already were brutal. This is why I've always been a fan of the Elam ending. It goes from playing basketball to playing something very different. And there's a lot of timeouts and stoppages and fouls. And now you're adding these lengthy replay reveals. It's like this super intense game that comes to a grinding, screeching halt at the end. And it's just a bad product. There's all that can be fixed. And as far as the urgency goes, there's things they can do. They could drop the length of the season by 20% and get rid of back-to-backs and do all this kind of stuff. They'll never do that, but they could do that. But even if they did that, it would only incrementally improve some of those urgency related issues. And so really, I think it's about the NBA embracing and understanding that they're not the NFL and that they're not going to be this appointment viewing television. It's going to be an inventory game. And so it almost actually makes sense for Adam Silver to be doing things like adding play-in tournament, adding in-season tournament, increasing inventory, because that's actually a better way for them to make money relative to trying to drive urgency. And so like, that's the thing. It's such, like, I would argue the NBA is one of the best social media products for sports because the highlights are just absurd and they fit so well in that portrait style format. Their faces are everywhere. They all have such big personalities. There is a global marketability to it that's different than some of these other sports. I think the NBA is doing really well outside of the specific problem of their individual TV ratings in these games. And so while I think that problem is real, I think it's important to at least acknowledge that the NBA is doing. I mean, I remember Clay Travis saying that the NBA media rights bubble was going to burst like 12 years ago. And here we are. They just signed this crazy lucrative deal. And so I'm not saying that he's wrong about anything necessarily, but I'm just saying that it's somewhat of a narrow-minded view of the totality of the NBA product.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe not wrong on why some people are tuning out of it, but the NBA, again, made a ton of money. I think everybody would view the rights package that Adam Silver negotiated as job well done, is what I would say. I'm thinking about how you fit into the ecosystem now versus Bill Simmons. A little distracted by that as I ping around extemporaneously. Well, I think what it is, we've said you are the why, and they are, how do the people I like react to it? How are they reacting to it? That's a very specific itch to scratch that I have as a fan myself, depending on what sport I'm following, the personalities I follow. There's that thing of, whoa, this thing happened. I have a reaction to it. I want to know how other people feel about it. It seems sort of sad when I say it that way, like we've lost community and I'm sort of exporting social whatever to these parasocial relationships on YouTube and in the podcast space. But I think that's what it's about. And I think that they're filling that space. These guys, I like their commentary. They give me a sense on what this baseline is of how people feel. I actually do want to know what Bill and Ryan say about the Jimmy Butler Warriors. I'm curious about that because that's what I'm watching night to night. And you are more of why is this happening diagnostically? And there's no formal way to fit these roles, just like maybe the Warriors don't have these formal roles for their different players, but those are the roles in the media ecosystem. It fits, it works.
Have you seen the awful coaching guy?
The awful coaching? No, I have not.
So it started on social media, and it's like literally like a version of what I've done with some of the film stuff, but like he'll show this footage. And he started by attacking Darvin Ham, but it became something he's done kind of around the league. But he literally like screams and shouts over the top, talking shit about the coaches. I don't know if you've seen this. Like legitimately yelling.
So what's that role? What role is that Philly right there?
It's so funny because like it's such a unique lane, but like if you go to his YouTube channel, like it performs pretty well. And like that's kind of the beauty of YouTube is everybody gets a lane. Like as long as the criteria for the lane is do people watch? And as long as you fit into that criteria, it can work. There have been other versions of that haven't made sense. Like I thought Twitter Spaces was a really interesting time where it was like, okay, there are these like 16 people on stage yelling, screaming at each other, but they're also putting up these big numbers. So like, what do you justify? Like, is there a way to monetize that or whatever? But like, so there's certain things where it's too far off the beaten path. But here's a guy who literally screams talking shit about NBA coaches over footage, and he has a lane on YouTube where he has success. And like that to me is the unique part of the business, is we all kind of just find our lane.
Well, the lane is sometimes a mirror. It's like an inverted mirror of what you're not getting from the mainstream. Right? What are you not getting from the mainstream? What are you not getting, frankly, from ESPN when you're watching? Harsh criticism that may be warranted at times. They, I think, for a variety of reasons, some of it is social, of just not wanting to make waves because they go to these games as broadcasters, as studio people. But this extends down to the journalists who need agents to give them the news, so they don't want to ruffle any feathers doing it that way. And so even when you've got something like the Nico Harrison-Luka trade, for instance, I'm watching the broadcast and I'm watching Bob Myers on the broadcast. Love Bob Myers, but it's just, hemming and hawing, and actually the deal could be good for the Mavericks. And I'm watching, I'm going, I don't think so. And there perhaps should be a place where people do unload and are harshly critical. And I see so much of that on YouTube. I see people on YouTube who are harshly critical of players, especially in a way that you don't see necessarily outside of maybe Stephen A. Smith, who it's sometimes unwarranted the way he does it. But that's what we're seeing. So YouTube, in a way, can be this discovery of a form of entertainment off of sports that never existed prior, but it can, in a weird way, also just be a reveal on how we've kind of lost that. And that used to be more part of what we had, and we don't have it as much. So now you're seeing the people do it in this informal way.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because there's this discussion about NBA media as if it's in this horrible place. And I just couldn't disagree more. Like, there is more high quality NBA analysis in the world than ever by far. Like and you just have to look for it, and it's not hard to find. That's the other thing. And it's like I respect the hell out of the Inside of the NBA guys. I agree with everybody that's one of the greatest sports shows ever created. I don't enjoy watching it that much, so I don't watch it. I don't watch Stephen A. Smith. Like it's one of those things where like
you're the doctor watching Grey's Anatomy going, that's not how they do it. You don't even prepare surgery that way. This is insane. I can't handle it.
I love the place that NBA media is in. There's just more of everything. There's more negativity, but there's also more nuance and positivity than ever before. There's more, all of that kind of stuff. You can find whatever you want. And so like, I don't really understand a lot of the complaints, because when's the last time you actually sat down and watched a full episode of SportsCenter? Not, I shouldn't say full episode. When's the last time you sat down and watched like 10 uninterrupted minutes of SportsCenter?
I feel like what song would be playing in the background for whatever year that was for the flashback scene, like a Linkin Park song. I don't know. I feel like it's been a while, to your point. Yes.
And they put up numbers. I'm not sitting here and pretending like they don't still have a large audience. But my point is that like, I feel like there are a lot of people who are making the effort to go find quality NBA content. And a lot of it kind of feels like, straw man's the wrong word, but it feels like hyper focusing on an issue that really isn't that big of an issue. I actually wanted to pitch this to you because I've always found this fascinating. This has been one of the most interesting parts of this profession. So like, I've had a few conversations with KD behind the scenes about this. I've talked with a bunch of other people in the business about this. The concept of like criticizing players and players pushing back on criticism. I think it's fascinating because on one level, I appreciate the dynamic that they're feeling, which is like, I'm one of the greatest basketball players on planet Earth, and I work relentlessly hard in my profession. What the hell could you ever tell me about the game, about what I'm doing wrong, and so on and so forth? And like, I do a ton of prep, and I have experience playing the game. But even me, relative to an NBA player, is a flat out amateur. And there's good reason for that visceral response that players feel when they're getting criticized. That said, I think it's fascinating because I think criticism is vital to the authenticity or the credibility of any show. Because if you're standing up and analyzing and you're not talking about the mistakes that are being made and the failures that are taking place, you're not appropriately contextualizing the game. And the game in and of itself is nasty and competitive and mean, and people try to step on each other's throats to get where they want to get to. And so it just creates this really interesting dynamic where we have to be critical, all of us. And I mean, you did the same thing when you were covering the Warriors. There's a certain amount of criticism that is mandatory in our profession, but it leads to this visceral response from players that I kind of sympathize with. So have you ever had a take on that specifically?
Yeah, I got it. I remember David Lee way back in the day confronted me in the locker room when I said the Warriors should trade him. And I understood, if you're him, you're looking at me. It's like, who are you to say anything about me? But at the same time, the Warriors probably should have traded him. And that's just, it is what it is. It's nothing personal. And I've had it in a way where it used to be part of my life. And I think there was more of a balance to it, where there was just less media and there was an honor to it. There was an honor to, you would crush a guy, but you had to show up and face the music and have that very uncomfortable person-to-person interaction, and in a way that kind of kept things balanced, where, yeah, you could have your take about them and they could be really mad at you, but you had to deal with it one-on-one, and you were the only person to really have the take. There weren't many people who were in media. It was extremely gatekept, and now everybody's in media. So when they complain about the criticism they get, it's everybody. I mean, KD argues with people like random fans, right? And I think what drives him, this is also something I can understand. What drives him is that he's really competitive. He's done so much to become great. And it's the sense that him, and I think a lot of other guys have, of why can't I shut the noise off? Why can't I just do enough to where this is no longer nagging me psychologically, and this is no longer a problem in my life? And I think when you've accomplished as much as they've accomplished and made their dreams come true to this measure that's just almost hard to fathom, you and I know why they can't shut the noise off and why they can't win that ultimate war. We get it. But at some level, there's something in them often that I think resists getting it or accepting it. And they really wrestle with it. And then what drives them crazier is that sometimes there's a guy on their team who might get none of it. Durant, maybe he wouldn't admit this, it's detailed in my book, would be very frustrated with how Klay Thompson was treated by the media. He would be, because Klay, at least back then, had about 100% approval rating, and Klay goes 4-15, almost nobody cares, and Klay goes off, everybody celebrates it and thinks it's the greatest thing, and he was just in that weird zone guys find themselves in sometimes, of being the sort of player where everybody appreciates you when you show up, but it's not on you when the team loses. And I get why Klay was in that particular place, but for Kevin, it was really hard. And now I'm just digressing and going a bunch of directions. I don't know if I'm really addressing your question properly. I guess what I'm saying is that the guys who are so competitive and sometimes to the point of myopia, they should have the perspective that the criticism is going to come regardless, but they, especially a guy like Kevin, he doesn't want to accept how it is. He's really big on ought and not necessarily big on is. He's big on it ought to be this way. I ought to be able to fight these battles for my reputation. I deserve it. Why can't I? Why can't I? And I think other guys in that position, they're dogged by all the criticism, but maybe they can just accept it is what it is. And that's a lot of what's going on. People just trying to tailor the situation to what they want it to be when they've been able to tailor every other situation to this point.
A few more videos with a cute dog on a boat, and I think KD would have gained a little bit more of that approval rating. The specific thing I was debating with Kevin, and this is something that I feel pretty passionate about. There's this and Draymond has been someone who's kind of driven this bus a little bit too, this idea of the new media and the idea that there's too many of these Skip Bayless types out there that are just blowhards that don't, this is the way they portray it. Right.
Yeah.
And the thing that I push back on it is I actually think that's a much bigger problem among former players. And and the thing that drives this, in my opinion, is that imagine you're in my position. This lane that I'm in is my entire life. And it's everything that I've been trying to build as a young adult coming to fruition in this lane. These people are millionaires that have spent from 15 to 35 killing themselves to be the best basketball players that they could be. And now they're in this other phase of their career where they probably don't want to grind like that. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them. But I think in the absence of that sort of relentless, pursuit that they had when they were younger, it kind of manifests as this surface level, more critical, shit talky kind of analysis. And then it gets exacerbated by I think a little bit of the jealousy of the current era in terms of the amount of money the guys make and just the level of fame that they can achieve. And so it turns into this situation where you've just got a bunch of these former NBA players that arguably are the most well equipped to teach us about the game, that aren't teaching us about the game. They're talking shit.
Well, that's, I think, core to the NBA mentality and why the NBA is different from baseball. Because the way baseball works, if we're on the same team and you're hitting a bunch of home runs, it does nothing to my opportunities. It takes nothing away from me. Maybe it even helps me because you're batting behind me. And now the pitcher is actually going to pitch to me. So you're helping me. So when you watch some of these former players on MLB TV, they are just, they're just so inclined to praise the players right now. Doesn't really matter. It doesn't make baseball more popular than basketball, but this is just the difference. Ironically, paradoxically, because baseball is such an individualistic sport, it makes the players more generous of spirit and more of a teammate in that sense. Basketball, if you're doing better and we're on the same team, very likely I'm doing worse. You're getting more shots, I'm getting fewer shots. There's not an infinite amount of shots. That mentality, I think, is part of why you see the jealousy come out, because it's ingrained. Everybody knows if they're on a team, and it's why you mentioned Bill Simmons and The Secret. Well, why was The Secret about sacrifice in that way? It sounds maybe corny. It maybe sounds a little bit, I don't know, cliche, but sacrifice is a bigger deal and more part of the success ultimately in basketball than it is for other sports, because basketball sets you up to be more selfish and have more incentives to be selfish than those other sports. And it is so ingrained that it's even part of the commentary of people who were tired decades ago. I'm convinced of it.
You were talking about the on-ball, off-ball dynamic with Jimmy Butler earlier. It's almost like I almost look at it as my terms versus the team's terms. There are players that they can succeed when things are happening on their terms. But then as soon as you disrupt that ecosystem in some way, they struggle to find a way to impact winning. There's been a good amount of that redundancy with the Phoenix Suns, specifically with Bradley Beal, where it's if there's a certain value you can get out of Bradley Beal when you play on his terms. But the problem is he's not as good at that shit as Devin Booker and Kevin Durant. So then now he's being asked to play on the team's terms, which is asking him to function more as one of those weak side scoring players like we talked about earlier. And also as a guy who like they need to guard and to rebound and to do all of these things that Brad's entire career has been about him conserving energy in those areas so that he can be good on his terms. And so like I think that's part of like what separates the best guys. Like the idea of Steph's ability to play off the ball or him becoming a very good defender. By the way, I think it's hilarious how much better Steph has been on defense since the Jimmy trade.
Rabbit to chase.
Yeah. And then and LeBron, like with Luka, like he's gone almost entirely off the ball when Luka has the ball, and he's become one of the best defensive players in the league because he's saying, in order for this team to succeed, we got to play on Luka's terms. And that means I need to fit into this like different concept on both ends of the floor. And so like, I think that's a kind of a foundational basketball trait. And to your point, it manifests that there are people that when they're not playing on their terms, they get unhappy and it starts to manifest in some contentiousness and nastiness.
This is the blood and bones aspect, but maybe a little bit more the brains, the psychology of it. I've made this point before, but I had a friend who sat down with, I think it was the Memphis Grizzlies coaches years ago, and he was allowed to, as a non-coach, sit down in the coaches' meeting and just observe. And what he was blown away with, and what shocked him, is just how much they spent on telling their game plan, on what their game plan was going to be, on telling a guy that he was going to the bench and was going to be brought in as a sixth man. This dominated the coaches' meeting. This dominates what they talk about. This soothing of egos behind the scenes, because it's a real problem. I mean, so much of, if your team is going to succeed or fail, to the Bradley Beal example, how is this guy going to deal with the reverse of being Peter Principled? Can he thrive with a demotion? Can he thrive when demoted? Or is he just going to unravel and be lost? That's the behind the scenes that you are not seeing. You see the ultimate product when they're on the floor, but that's what most of coaching is. As much as we look at the strategy and the lineups and everything else, most of coaching behind the scenes is actually stuff like that. And every team has it. I've talked about Kuminga. The Warriors would need him to be like an Aaron Gordon, but he wants to be a Kawhi Leonard. So how do you get somebody to thrive and produce with what they are going to view as undermining their quest to their dreams and their glory? That's a lot of what's going on behind the scenes with a basketball team that you're just never going to have to deal with when it comes to a baseball team, unless you're sending a pitcher to the bullpen. And even then, they've just got to pitch. That's just got to be what it is. It's just a different situation.
I was just going to bring up Kuminga because he's such a perfect example. You don't think he looks at Moses Moody and goes, "I'm a better basketball player"?
Of course,
and
he does.
and he's probably right, as long as you can play on Kuminga's terms. But all of a sudden, we have a team here that's got a chance to win a championship, and it's no longer about Jonathan Kuminga and his terms. And the reality is the two things that Moses Moody does in that position, which is guard the ball and shoot spot up corner threes. Like Kuminga's probably nearly as good on the ball, but he's just not as functional in their offense with the starting group. And so you don't think Steve Kerr's having that same discussion right now? How do we pitch to Kuminga how he's going to fit into this? And by the way, like, I'm not 100% sure that's going to go well. I don't think it'll have a bearing on the team because I think they kind of have a identity entirely separate from Kuminga now. But like that, a big swing factor will be, can they get him to embrace fitting into something that's not on his terms?
Sometimes the player is right too. That's the other complicated part of it. The Thunder were saying, "Hey, James Harden, you've got to be this very specific role we've envisioned for you, like a Manu Ginobili." And James Harden was saying, "I'm a superstar." And James Harden was right. And so that's the other difficult thing, is that sometimes the team, what they want from the player, we're looking at a situation where we can all eat. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. But there are situations where, hey, they're really undermining this guy's ability to make hundreds of millions of dollars with what they think he's capable of. There's just a lot to it. There's a lot of politics behind the scenes of it. The NBA is pretty vicious in that way. And that's something that the former players or the current players podcasting, I actually think can reveal. This is the final thing to end on. I didn't think we would end on, but Draymond going after Cat and saying that he was avoiding Jimmy Butler, and it turned out that Cat was going to his girlfriend's friend's funeral. That was a situation where I saw people in media and people on Twitter going after Draymond, but I was looking at it, I was going, nobody's going to say this, but behind the scenes, a lot of players look at somebody going to the girlfriend's friend's funeral instead of your game, and that's something that's not looked upon. I don't know. It's not looked upon favorably, but socially you wouldn't want to come out and say it. And so I don't even know. I'm tossing you a tricky issue right there, but that was interesting to me when I saw that happen, because there was a lot of public conversation and it was different from the back channel conversation.
Yeah, this is something that me and Sam Esfandiari talk about a lot, just like the reality of like how there's this like public perception of the way people should behave, but then within the specific context of sports, there is a nastiness and like a mean, non-politically correct kind of approach that all these players have with each other, because they're basically the gladiators of the modern age. they're just functioning on an entirely different mental level. And so on that front, I agree. My beef with Draymond, and I've talked about this on my show, the issue that I have with it is, like we talked about earlier, Draymond to me is one of the guys who has the ability to truly educate people on how beautiful the game of basketball has become. And instead, I'm seeing him complain about the modern game, and I'm seeing him engage in personal attacks, and it just kind of reminds me of the stuff we were talking about earlier, where it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to learn more from somebody who's in it every single day.
Yeah. Well, I think if he wants to be bluntly honest and blow some guys up, it will at least be interesting. But yeah, maybe it's the TNT effect is rubbing off on Draymond, that cynicism. There's something else going on with them where they always complain, but I think that they don't like how the TV rights was handled, and that's infected some of the commentary. So is there anything else you want to hit, or should I let you go back to being the hardest working guy in all of NBA media?
The last thing I'll say about the Draymond thing, just because it's fun, I will say, just because I wish he would teach people about the game more doesn't mean I don't find him entertaining. And like one of my favorite moments last year was that fan video from the crowd of Game 2 of the Mavs Wolves series, where it's like pointed at the arena and it shows Luka hitting the step back over Gobert, and then it just turns and pans up to Draymond in the TNT box.
Oh man,
he's just having the time of his life up there, just laughing his ass off. I think Draymond is an incredible media professional. My beef with it is it's a little hypocritical for him to talk about new media and the way the game is discussed, and then to engage in some of that behavior.
Oh yeah. I mean, players, they want all the benefits and all the costs, but I'm not going to criticize Draymond, which my subscribers get mad at me for, because I'm going to Warriors practice this week. I'm going this week. So after that, then I change it up, and the candor comes, but I still have to show up. I want to check this. I try to go to about one a year and just get a sense of things as an outsider's insider, an insider's outsider. But anyway, Jason, you do a fantastic job. I have a sense of what you're going to promote for us, but what do you want to promote on the outro?
So just our YouTube channel, Hoops Tonight, wherever you get your podcast, Hoops Tonight. Social media, I'm most active on Twitter at _JasonLT. And Ethan, it's always so much fun coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to next time, man.
The feeling's more than mutual. Can't wait to have you back. Thanks so much, Jason.